topic that I was asked to address tonight was basically the general issues of Sefer Bereishit. In the sense that the way I'm going to look at it is that a lot of people like to talk about the stories in Bereishit almost like the stories of a dysfunctional family. Okay, obviously the brothers and Yosef come to mind, but you have the behavior between Esav and Yaakov, and you have the behavior between Yishmael and Yitzchak, and then Abraham's behavior towards Hagar. And the fact is that it looks like some people it looks like a dysfunctional family. The fact is, though, is that it for sure doesn't look like you're talking about the first family. In other words, if you think in terms of talking about the family, the first family of the Jewish people, those who represent the ideal of Jewishness in a certain way, it just seems that the whole family is it's just strange. I mean, the story of Yosef and the brothers, and the fact that they quarreled, and the fact that Yaakov Avinu has to get the bracha through tricking his father, and even statements. There was I think it was a Reform Rabbi, what's his name, Weiss, in the 1800s, who basically tried to argue that Isaac, and Lo Aleinu we should even say this, but he says that I'm going to use the word Isaac because we're using his idea, was a product of an elderly couple, and we know that mental retardation increases with age, with increased age, and therefore there's this whole argument that they say that Isaac needed someone to take care of him, and therefore the search for Rebecca was really a search for a caregiver, because he was born to an elderly couple, and so forth and so forth, and therefore there's this whole idea that he must, and that's why there's not so much about him, and very little is about him. He doesn't seem to be the great. What? I'm sorry. Yeah, well, yeah, but that's the midrash. The fact is in the book. But that she was a kind, caring person. So, but the fact is what you're left with is this whole idea that they downplay this and so forth. And the fact is that if you look, the story of Yitzchak, I mean, even in terms of the dynamics, the fact that Yitzchak seems to be constantly dominated by Rivka, or has to be taken care of by Rivka, and seems to be very passive in his role as one of the fathers of the Jewish people. It's not the kind of story. If you were writing the story, you would not expect this to be the story that would be written. If you were trying to talk about penning the story of the first family, you know what I mean? You have George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and saying, I did it, I can't tell why. You don't have these stories where it's and also when you really get into it, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, there's a little bit of seduction and even, I mean, there's so many stories. I mean, Yehuda and Tamar, I mean, goes to a prostitute and then pays his bills. He's an honest guy, but the story that he goes. I mean, the stories just don't seem to represent the kind of stories you would expect if you wanted to present this idea, especially in terms of the conflicts. And there's a tremendous amount of conflicts, and the conflicts are not necessarily resolved. Shimon and Levi and Yaakov. It may be that Shimon and Levi get the last word when the story is told about Shechem and about what happens in Shechem, and Shimon and Levi basically say, well, then this happened to our daughter, but later on when the brachos are given to by Yaakov, basically puts Shimon and Levi in their place. So, and then you have Ruvain and the way it's presented of what he does, with Bilhah, with his with his, with Rachel's concubine who's taking the place of Rachel and so forth and so forth. Reuben gets upset. I mean, but on the surface, it seems that he sort of has some type of indiscreet meeting with his wife's concubine. And there's a lot of stories there. What?
His father's concubine.
Right, his father's concubine. Right. It's just, and then the way Shmuel's thrown out of the house, and there's a lot of stories you don't expect is from the first family. And you look at the Midrashim, and the Midrashim explain everything away. You try to explain everything this way, and so forth and so forth. But the fact is that you're still left with the question of, okay, you can explain it away, but what's really going on here? I mean, it's one thing to try and say, yeah, this is what happens, but the text doesn't read this way, and you can explain how the text works it out, and so forth and so forth. But there seems to be something that sort of raises that sort of question of why present it in this way at all. There's certain ways you have whenever you look at a Chumash. There's ways of answering questions in Chumash. You have the answers from Torah Sheba'al Peh, from the Gemara, from the Midrashim, but you're still left with the question, but why is it said this way? I mean, you have ways of explaining it and so forth and so forth, but you still have the black and white text. So what's the indication? What's getting across? So the truth is you have a tremendous amount of questions today for Bereishit of what you expect from the first family. And I think that it falls upon us to really look at the stories in Sefer Bereishit from a very different perspective. Most people look at Sefer Bereishit from a historical perspective. It's telling you history. That's one perspective. In terms of actual literal history, or whether there's some allegory in it or not. But I would venture to say that the big issue of really reading through Sefer Bereishit is really understanding the whole concept of process. And once you understand that the stories in Sefer Bereishit are not necessarily to tell you conclusions, but to tell you how you met your challenge, how you meet the problems, then you begin to look at Sefer Bereishit in a bit of a different perspective. Ethics is not just a matter of knowing what's right and wrong. Ethics is a process of determining what are the factors in trying to identify what the issues have to be considered in trying to figure out the best way to behave. And usually in that process, you don't end up with a simple black and white answer of right and wrong. Usually in that process, what you're left with is first process of understanding the challenges and the issues, and then understanding that the conclusions you're going to reach are not necessarily going to be simple, easy, and clean. One of the things that always hit me in many of the stories of Bereishit is the fact that the stories never end up with they lived happily ever after in terms of 100% clean, nice stories, everything works out nicely. The stories really deal with the challenges of life and end up with the fact that even if the story ends up with most of the things worked out, some things aren't worked out. A classic example, I've mentioned it many times, is the story of Esav and Yaakov, right? Where it's not clear cut what's happening, but even if Yaakov is correct in faking out Yitzchak, there's still consequences to him faking out Yitzchak. There's still consequences to it. And the fact is that in a certain way, it's a blemish on Yaakov that he went through this. And the Midrashim point to the fact that Esav's scream when he has the birthright loss, when he loses the bracha, is something that is considered to be and negative in terms of staying with the Jewish people, as a negative in terms of allowing Esav to maintain a position of power over the Jewish people. Okay, in other words, they say that the cry of Esav, when he cries, why there's no bracha for me, it's almost, that's the assurance that there's going to be a galus, and the galus is not going to be easy. It's the fact that even if you do the right thing, don't think that the conclusion of doing the right thing is going to be totally good. It's not necessarily going to be totally good. And this is something that is constantly pointed out. I think it's pointed out in other cases. You take Shimon and Levi and Yaakov. I think there's no resolution of what to do, because in the end, it's almost like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. It's sometimes in this world, you don't know what the right answer is. And you don't know, do this, there's going to be this consequence. Do that, there's going to be that consequence. You have to pick the consequence that has the more positive results, but understand that you also are going to end up with some of the negative results. And really what that does is it changed looking at Sefer Bereishit from telling you stories and conclusions of telling you what these righteous individuals did, to more significantly how these righteous individuals read situations, and knowing full well that there will be positive and negative consequences to what they have to do, they all did it. They still did what they had to do. And it has good parts and it has bad parts. And in many ways, if you look through the stories of Bereishit, it's almost like the stories are not stories that really are great stories in terms of telling you behavior that we are happy it occurred, or behavior that we're proud of, but more of like, it's almost like, given the circumstances, it's almost behavior that, gee, there were really hard sides to it, but it's really, but I understood why the person did it, and perhaps that's that's perhaps the most significant thing. In fact, you have people who are really thinking through things and trying to work it out. And they understand that there's going to be consequences this way, consequences that way, and they're trying to figure out how best to deal with it. I think one of the classic examples of that is the story of Rachel and Leah, in the sense that Rachel works, Yaakov works for 7 years to marry Rachel, and he knows that his future father-in-law is a con man. So he's concerned that at the last moment, right, the switch is going to be made, and that Leah is going to be substituted for Rachel. And you think about this. Leah, a righteous woman, what terrible situation must she have been in to have accepted faking out her future husband? Say, hey, listen, you go in and you fake out being Rachel tonight, and you sleep with Yaakov and be okay. I mean, what kind of situation was Leah in to do that? That's a tough situation. And yet she does it. And then you have the statement where Rachel and Yaakov are concerned that Laban is going to pull off a fast one. Laban is going to throw out this idea that we don't marry off the younger before the older. And I saw someone say there's a little bit of a shtoch in it. It says, over here we take care of the older ones first. It's like, Yaakov, we know what you did to Esav back there, and you the younger one will install the birthright from your father, but we don't do it. We're going to follow it right, and we're going to make sure that the older one goes first. With the implication almost like, and you should have expected this, because obviously I met Leah first, because the older one has to go first. Okay. Anyways, but Rachel and Yaakov are expecting it, so they have a sign, some kind of way to ensure that everything's going to be okay, so that expecting there to be this trick done at the end, right? Rachel will be able to identify herself, and it'll be okay. What happens is Rachel is so concerned about the embarrassment to her sister, she reveals the secret password to Leah. Okay, at the cost of her own marriage, at the cost of hurting her husband, and that happens, and so Leah is able to be identified as the wife, and therefore they have, once they have relations, there's no way that this marriage will be annulled, whatever. So therefore, the marriage goes through. And you look at this and you see these individuals struggling. You see Rachel. Imagine what kind of woman Rachel must have went through. Even Leah, to say, I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do this, and Rachel concerned about her sister's plight. The fact is that that's the kind of issues that you think you're talking about in Bereishit. And in many ways, it's not necessarily coming down to whether you agree with the conclusion or not. It's coming down to understanding the dilemma. And I think that that's really significant in the story of Joseph and the brothers. There is an ongoing disagreement with them. This disagreement is not worked out. It's not necessarily worked out. In the end, Joseph and the brothers still have disagreement. But the point is they're struggling with it on a moral level. Because that's what life is about. In many ways, righteousness is not just simply, I know the right thing to do and this is always the right thing to do. In many ways, knowing the right thing to do itself is a tremendous dilemma. You don't necessarily always know what the right thing is to do. It's sometimes very, very difficult even to understand what the question is. You know, it's like, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do this? Should I do this? And the point is, it's sometimes very difficult. And if you understand that the issue is not so much in whether you get the conclusion correct, obviously you want to have the conclusion, it's being involved in the process. And in many ways, that's one of the things that I really take away from reading, especially the story of Joseph and the brothers. The brothers are going back and forth about what the right thing is to do. And you see it very much in them going back and forth even with the sale of Joseph. Where individual, Reuben is saying, we'll take him aside, and then, Reuben is concerned, I'll separate them, then I'll save them by myself. In the group, even though Reuben was the oldest brother and had some power, he's concerned that in the group, would they accept him, but maybe individually I can do it. The fact is that reflects the point that the individuals are not 100% sure what the right thing is to do or not. They don't necessarily know. And throughout the stories in the parsha, what you have is dilemma after dilemma of what's the right thing to do. I can go through so many stories, and the issue is what's the right thing to do, and the real issue is determining the factors to consider in the right thing to do. So you take Yehuda and Tamar. Yehuda doesn't want to give Tamar over because he's concerned. Maybe his third son will die because of this. It's a legitimate concern. You know. On the other hand, Tamar's just wasting away in terms of what happens here and so forth. What's the right thing to do? Okay, and Tamar says, well, you're missing one factor. Okay, there were other things going on that caused more problems. But if you would have known about that, you may have dealt with this a little bit differently. You don't necessarily know all the facts. But what you have is people understanding that one of the dilemmas we have in trying to define good and evil is, first of all, trying to define what are all the factors, do we have all the information, and then trying to come up with a conclusion. And that conclusion is not necessarily going to be right, but at least has to show a little bit of the dilemma. And by the way, this is one of the stories that exists throughout Jewish history, over and over again. I was watching someone talk about the Ramchal. We think of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. By the way, this comes up so many times where we have great individuals who, to us, you say the name, and this is a person who is totally on board, okay. But how many people in Jewish history do you have that they weren't always so accepted? So Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was put in the harem in Padua. He was excommunicated. Now, he's, say the Mesilas Yesharim, the path of the just. I mean, come on. It's a classic work of Jewish thought. Okay, Hasidus and the Vilna Gaon. Okay, and Kasha. The truth is that so many times in Jewish history you have this dilemma. I don't know what to do. I'm not sure. I have to make a decision. And the point is and sometimes that decision is something. Well, how could you excommunicate the Ramchal? How could you excommunicate the Rambam? Right? And the fact is that it really shows the dilemma and the challenge of life. And really the call upon the individual is to get involved in the process. Are you thinking through things? You're not necessarily going to get the answer right, because maybe there's factors you don't know about, and so forth and so forth. But the truth is you have to be aware of the whole idea of the process. And what I see in Bereishit is constantly that idea of the process, and the dilemma involved, and the back and forth. I wrote about this in an Insight a few weeks ago about Sarah and Hagar, right? Where Sarah was really, the whole idea of having a son to Abraham. So he said, okay, listen, go and sleep, go and have relations with Hagar, and you'll have a kid that way. One of the interesting things is, it seems in that time period, it seemed to have been a normal thing where a wife could take a servant and just give her to her husband to have kids. Can't have a kid with me, we'll take the servant and have a kid with her. And the servant wasn't asked any questions. It wasn't the servant was just said, this is your new job. Congratulations. That's not what Sarah did. Sarah said, you should marry Abraham. Take on the status of wife. Equal status of wife. Okay? You should be a wife. And therefore you should be my equal. Okay? And there was a little bit of a dilemma like that, because her becoming an equal meant that that Sarah was no longer the dominant woman in the household. So at that point in time, this was part of the dilemma, back and forth. On one hand, Hagar was getting messages that you're my equal. On the other hand, Sarah was still Sarah Imenu and a major figure in terms of the household, and she also wanted to make sure that the child that would be raised by Hagar would be raised as her child, knows the child of the couple, Avram and Sarah. So that's what she thought was going to happen. He was going to take on that status. And that creates a dilemma. How do you have equality and inequality at the same time? And that's part of it. And Hagar went through this. You see Mepharshim talking about this in the way Hagar related to, the way Sarah related to Hagar. On one hand, she was giving messages to Hagar, you're my equal, but I want you to be a wife, I want you to agree to this, you should accept being a wife, not just a concubine, but a full-fledged wife. On the other hand, there was an idea of her still being, of Sarah still having a certain position of dominance. How do you create both? And that created problems back and forth. How do you deal with it? Okay, and Hagar didn't know exactly what was going on. Hagar in many ways was also a righteous woman, especially if you say that Hagar is Keturah, who again remarried, is a woman who marries Avram after Sarah passes away. The fact is that Avram's not just going to marry anyone. Keturah, being a wife of Avram, must also be a certain righteous person. So the Medrash says she was Hagar. So it's not Hagar is such a bad person. The problem is that there's a dilemma here. And life raises so many of those dilemmas. So if you switch over looking at Bereishit as...
And again, the text supports that in that
right.
the reason Hagar was sent away the first time is Vatekel Gevir Taveina.
Right.
Sarah became literally light, less important in her eyes.
Exactly.
So that's
but that was because but Sarah created that situation because she wanted Hagar to feel comfortable there as a wife. The situation came about through the balancing. The fact is if you don't look at the story as just simply history, you don't look at the story as just telling you this is righteous behavior. You look at the story as understanding the process of life and trying to deal with life from an ethical, moral perspective, and you recognize that there are a lot of challenges in that regard. It's much of our challenge in life is trying to understand the process, and in many ways we ignore that process. I can look at many of the cases in our world today. I'm following the news in the States. Ferguson, and this other case down in New York, and so forth and so forth. And the point, and the problem is just trying to deal with the process of the situation. How do you deal with this? And it's Charles Barkley got involved, and therefore Kenny Smith gets involved. We read, these two basketball players had a little bit of a disagreement over them. So the problem is that it's not a process that happens in a minute. It's a process of years of effects, of concerns, of so forth and so forth. It's like I think a lot of the argument is not so much what actually happened in these circumstances, but what was the whole milieu that happened within. Is there an anti-black feeling with people? And then Charles Barkley says, yeah, well, guess what? I get more frightened if I'm being followed by a black youth than someone else. And the fact is that it's a problem. It's dealing with the world the way it is, and all the different dilemmas. And the fact is that in many ways, the halacha does not work on a black and white ethical conclusion. Halacha works upon a lot of the moral innuendos, the ethical and moral ideas that can be clouded into the whole idea. So we're constantly dealing with process. It's interesting. I just, for example, and when you see these things, what I find is in so many ways people want to simplify. So therefore you want simple answers and simple ideas. But you really get involved in the process, you really understand the dilemma. For example, in the case in Har Nof, the tragedy happened in Har Nof, one of the terrorists supposedly worked in a convenience store, in a store, in the Har Nof area. So this is a factor to be considered with the argument that one of the arguments is in order to make the Arab population in Israel feel more at home in Israel and therefore more integrate them into the society is by offering them work. And if we offer them work, they'll be integrated more, and there'll be a greater ability to coexist. So people responded, yeah, what are you talking about? One of these guys worked in that store. Okay, worked in a store in the Har Nof area, and you see what happened. So therefore there's this challenge that maybe the argument is having Arabs work in the community is not going to be an answer. Therefore, an issue developed in Israel of whether you want Arab workers in the city or not. I think the mayor of Ashkelon says he doesn't want any Arab workers, and so forth and so forth. The mayor of Yerushalayim said the other way around. I remember a story years ago of someone who worked in a store in the Jewish area. A store in the Jewish area. And this person used to talk to me and my wife. He liked us and so forth and so forth. But he would also talk about certain customers in the store that the people working in the store really didn't like. You know what I mean? They really didn't like them. And they used to do little things like, to mess up their orders or stuff like that. In other words, just because someone works in the area doesn't mean that they're all going to like you. In other words, what hit me, I remember that story. When I heard that, I said, gee, you know something? If you had our workers working in the area, yeah, they'd have a job. But then there's a responsibility upon the Jewish customers to make sure that they are acting properly to these Arab workers. Now, this is not just, I'm not challenging, don't do terrorism no matter what else. Anyway, that's not my argument. My argument is just giving someone a job is not going to be the answer. Giving someone a job and ensuring that the community continues to treat him as a mensch is the way that you're going to make him feel comfortable within the community. Okay, the point is, I remember that story from this guy who worked in a store in the Jewish area, and basically, just because he worked in the Jewish area did not mean that he didn't have any, he only had positive feelings toward Jews. Guess what? He had toward, not across the board, but it wasn't 100% positive feelings towards Jews. In certain ways, because some of the Jewish customers did not treat him nicely. So the point is that with that comes a certain aspect of responsibility. So if you're going to sit there and say, we will get along better with them if we give them jobs, yeah, but then you better also make sure that you treat them in a certain way. Now, this is not to explain I'm just saying that it's a little bit more complicated than you think on the surface. Giving them jobs and everything's going to be okay. No, giving them jobs in a certain fashion, everything's going to be okay. But you have to make sure you maintain it. And that's a continuing process of life. And in many ways, the way I understand Bereishit is a continuing story of life. You see life events, and you see people who intentionally wanted to do what was good, make decisions of trying to do what was good. On the other hand, you see people also making mistakes. It's very interesting in terms of the people who make mistakes. Let's look the other way around. Esav, if you try to color him as Mr. Evil, black and white, Mr. Evil, it's very, very difficult. Esav is a very complex figure. First of all, he is the prototype of how to respect parents. He's considered to be the prototype of Kibbutz. He treated Yitzchak with such honor. He's like the constant example of that. Also, there's something very interesting that happens. Yitzchak, think about this in terms of Esav's behavior, in terms of what happens with Yaakov and the bracha. Yaakov steals the bracha, so Esav is angry. He says, after Yitzchak dies, I'm going to take care of my brother. After the mourning period, after the death of Yitzchak, Yitzchak's not even sick. Yitzchak's not dying. Esav says, down the road, sometime in the future, right, as long as Yitzchak's alive, I'm not doing anything to Yaakov, because I know it'll bother Yitzchak too much. Then, after the mourning, I'll do something. No, so after the mourning, he's going to do something. So it's going on. Okay. Then, he seems really uptight. Rivka hears about it, says, okay, Yaakov, we better get away, because that's what happens. Then Yitzchak and Rivka are telling Yaakov, we don't want you to marry daughters from these people. Here, go back to the family, right? What does Esav do? Oh, gee whiz, I didn't know it bothered my parents. So I'm going to go marry a Ishmaelite. Yeah, he's obviously not totally black. He's trying to consider and so forth and so on. He's going back. So what's the problem in Esav? It seems to be Esav wants to do some things that are nice and so forth and so on, but there's an aspect where he doesn't seem to be constantly recognizing this dilemma. In other words, in the process, when we look at the process, you can look at the brothers, you look at the brothers at Yosef, you look at the issues of Shmuel, they want to do what's right. And it's a dilemma coming to the right conclusion. Esav also likes to do what's right, but he's not as committed to such working out what's right. So it seems to be...
I always viewed Esav as having more of a view for the present, for this world, for the expedient, rather than for a long-term plan.
Even in terms of that expedience, it's an interesting way of putting it. It's expedient in the fact that he is not willing to take on the true challenge. His long-term doesn't just mean, long-term, what's good 6 months from now. Long-term also means recognizing the complexity of the situation. And the answer today may not be the answer, may have to be worked on to be the answer for tomorrow. It's like building a good baseball team. It doesn't mean you lose right away. It means it takes time. You have to take this step, that step, so forth, so forth, so forth. So the point is, you got to make sure everything goes into place. And I'm using a crazy example, but then hopefully down the road it will have some kind of results. Esav seems to be expedient. He does want to have some good conclusions, but it's not the fact that he fully understands the dilemmas involved and all the factors that are involved. I mean, the truth is that it's very interesting if you think about this. Leah is so concerned because she thinks she's going to end up with Esav. Why? Because there must have been this idea that Esav and Yaakov were going to come back and marry Leah and Rachel. Esav has this idea where Yitzchak says you shouldn't marry people from around here, you should marry from the family. But that doesn't cause Esav to say, gee, I better go check out to see if there's any other kids over there. Right? Because actually, Lavan had 2 daughters, and Bilhah and Zilpah were also his daughters. Right? The fact of the matter is, there might have been other family members over there. But he sort of, like this is what I think you're saying, he sort of like uses a shortcut. Oh, but Yishmael's around the street, and Yishmael must be a good guy also, after all, he's Abraham's kid, so we'll go the shortcut. That seems to be what happens with Esav. Esav's a very fascinating figure. I mean, if you think about this, I forget about this, but I know only one of them. But the fact is that it says that on the death of Avram, the day that Avram dies, is the day that Esav turns to the dark side and does 5 Averas, right? Now, I forget what the 5 Averas are, but I know there's a lot of people who try to work it out, that the 5 Averas are not so simple Averas. They seem to be something where they can be semi-justified. For example, he killed a person that day. Who did he kill? Who's the person he killed that day? Okay? So who was the most evil person at that time? Mr. Evil in that generation. Real bad guy in that generation.
I don't know if Nimrod is still alive.
Well, he wasn't that day.
All right.
Nimrod. I mean, who did he kill? He killed Nimrod. He's sitting there saying, hey, wait a second. Is that a bad thing to kill Nimrod? I mean, so the fact is that Nimrod had reasons to kill Nimrod. The point is, who did he kill Nimrod? So the point is that there's this idea, but the fact is that the question is why go kill Nimrod that day? And why is that on his concern? And so forth and so forth. And was there another benefit that he was going to get out of this? The problem is that what you see is when you try to live life, you basically have to constantly deal with the issues of life, the processes you're going through, and so forth and so forth. And then you have to try and make the decision that is best given the various different factors you have to consider. I just read something very interesting. For example, it was in the Shari Yosher. Shimon Shkop was a major Rosh Hashiva before the war. He wrote a work called the Shari Yosher, which was basically on halachic theory. And he wrote an introduction to it. In his introduction, he develops a very interesting idea. It's an idea on precious and kedusha, on holiness and separation. It says in the verse, that kedoshim to you should be holy, and the Ramban says what kedosha means is you should be prushim, you should be separate, you should separate yourself a little bit. So the point is that the question is that why? Because Kodesh ni Hashem Elokeinu, because I, God, am Kodesh. So there's ideas you can be Kodesh, but you can't be Kodesh like God. But Kodesh means like God is holy, you're supposed to be holy. The point is that if you use the word Parush, separate, God's not really separate. It's just not interested. You know what I mean? In other words, Parush implies in kind of some aspect of separation. In other words, you have an attachment to it, and then you're separated to it. You can't really say that by God. God doesn't have an attachment to anyone else, right? God doesn't have any necessary desire from anyone else. To be Parush, it's like the Rabbi says, is don't be a glutton. You have a drive to eat. So Parush means don't let your drive overtake you. But you have to have a drive to eat in order to define yourself as someone who's being separate from eating. But if you don't have a drive at all for this, you can't really describe being Parush, being separate from it, as being the ideal, right? So the question is that what do you mean by Kodesh and Parush in terms of God? Because God doesn't really have a drive for it. So if I'm trying to tell you that hey, it's good not to be a glutton, and you put some control on your appetite, I can understand that. But when you say God's holy because He puts control on His appetite, He doesn't have an appetite. So what do you mean? What do you mean by control? So what Shimon Shkop says is that obviously, and he points this out, that the idea of holiness of God is different than our idea of holiness. But the fact is you have to understand what that distinction is supposed to be in terms of holiness. So he points it out like this. He says, the truth of the matter is that God is totally giving. Okay, God is totally meitiv. He's totally giving. So the fact that God is totally giving, it's like it's the fact that He does is that whatever He does is never for a self-interest. He has no self-interest. His interest is always in the benefit of others. So His relationship to human beings is for you, because He doesn't need your bracha, right? You say a bracha to God because it's good for you to say a bracha, but He doesn't need your bracha. Yeah.
Does He need the Jewish people to worship Him, respect Him, or something?
That's always the question. Why does God really need our worship? No, it's that God has a quote-unquote desire to benefit us, and one of the ways of benefiting us is through worshiping Him. In other words, giving us the ability to worship Him is a way of bringing some kind of let me just turn this off here. Giving Him the opportunity to worship Him is a benefit to us. It's a classic answer. But the fact is, He doesn't really have the need. Okay, and that's simple. It's not so simple, but that we'll just take it like that. So the question exists: is that true? So when we say that Kodesh, God is Kodesh, that He's separate, yeah, He has no interest. He has no interest. So how can we explain our separation from our appetites and compare it to God?
Isn't Perush a solution also?
Perush, it's a different Perush.
It's a totally different word. Okay. Sorry.
This is Perushim, and you're talking about Perush is an explanation.
Okay.
A different word. Okay. So the point is Shimon Shkop points out something like this. It says the truth is, if you took the idea of Prushim being separate on its simple level and said the same way God is separate, you should be separate, then you're left with a dilemma, and you'd have to say that the ideal for a human being is to be totally giving and to have no self-interest. So that the highest level of Prushim would be to basically be above appetite, not to have to desire, to be totally absent any desire. That would be the highest level, the same way God is like, and therefore the ultimate ideal is to be totally giving to others, because you have no desire yourself, and totally giving to others. Okay, so he says, but that's not the human being. The human being has to have a self-interest. So he points out that's where you get Meforshim pointing out the distinction between God and human beings, and that the Kedusha to human beings has to be different than what we mean by the word holy for God. What does it mean for us? It means that, and he develops this in a nice way, I'm sort of cutting down. It says basically, it means that even in our self-interest, we should try and do things that are beneficial to others. He says that's the real definition of what he means when the Ramban says of a pleasure that's menuvel b'shus Torah. A pleasure that's totally halachically permitted, but it's called menuvel b'shus Torah. It's called disgusting within the parameters of Torah. It's a pleasure that's only for your benefit. Okay? And there's an interesting example of this that I saw in terms of Simchas Yom Tov. There's a concept in terms of Simchas Yom Tov that we're supposed to rejoice in Yom Tov. That means you're supposed to have meat, and we're supposed to have wine, and we're supposed to, you're supposed to buy your wife new clothes, and it's supposed to be joyous, and so forth and so forth. But it's pointed out that included in Simchas Yom Tov must be, interesting question emerges, by the way, does the wife have an obligation to buy a new suit for the husband? It's a different question. Okay, but something like that. But because there's a whole issue whether the simcha is the husband has an obligation to rejoice with his wife, or specifically for the wife to be the recipient of the joy, or whether the wife also has an obligation to try and share joy with the husband. Okay. Anyways, the point is that there's an interesting question emerges like this. So he says that it's brought down halacha that in terms of Simchas Yom Tov, if all you do is pleasure for yourself, you buy yourself the good steak and you buy yourself a good bottle of wine, but you don't share it with others, and you specifically don't share it with poor people, it's not considered to be a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov. It's not even not considered to be a better way of rejoicing on Yom Tov. It's not considered even to be an acceptable way of rejoicing on Yom Tov, because real rejoicing within halacha is when you take care of yourself, you also take care of others, and that's what Shimon Shkop says. What Shimon Shkop says in terms of Prushim is about. Prushim is that you ensure that when you take care of yourself, when you have pleasure for yourself, that you are also ensuring that there's pleasure for others. So when you have that extra piece of cream puff, which has no medical value whatsoever, and the only one who's having benefit from it is yourself, that's Mishus Torah. But if you have that extra little piece of cream puff and you share it with others, and it's on your diet, and you can have a little bit of something like that because your family wants you to be healthy, and therefore you should have good food because that's considered to be an acceptable pleasure. Pleasure should not just be self-serving; it should be serving of others as well. So the point is that it really represents this idea that it's not just about you; it's about looking at the whole picture. So the truth is the reason I developed this idea is to show you that there's this balance. You have to take care of yourself. You can't just be a person who's only taking care of others, right? Then you end up dead. Right, but on the other hand, if you only take care of yourself, right, that's not really that's not really emulating God. Emulating God as a human being emulates God. God is totally giving. We can't be totally giving. So we have to ensure that when we are giving to ourselves, we also are giving to others. We have to see the bigger picture. And Rosh Hashanah says a beautiful word, which I heard years ago in yeshiva. It says a major distinction between the Jewish attitude of charity and the non-Jewish attitude of charity. The non-Jewish attitude of charity is based upon I and other, and I give to the other. I take away from the I and I give to the other. So Rosh Hashanah says no. The truth is that what the Jewish view of charity is extending the I. It said I is not just me. I is my family. I is my community. I is others. So that when I give to the homeless individual who's asking for something at the corner, I'm not just giving to him. I'm giving because he's part of me. We're part of the same collective of humanity. I, at a certain level, am giving to myself. And he expands it out. I mean, the fact is that first there's you, and then there's your family, expands out, and there's your community, Klal Yisrael, and then humanity in general. But it's an extension of the I, which is a very different perspective. Now that idea comes from the idea of, really in that idea, you're giving to others is an aspect of being godlike. Because God gives to others. You can't be totally godlike with no benefit to yourself. There has to be benefit to yourself. But the point is that kind of challenge of working through things, that's what I think Sefer Bereishit is about. Sefer Bereishit is about that process. So the challenge of that process, living through life, working through things. And the fact is, over and over you see these stories. And where you see issues that arise in somewhat with even Yishmael and even Asaph, right? They're not totally black, right? There's process involved. The point is their method of dealing with the process is not dealing with it with the full rigor of trying to come out to a conclusion. But even those who deal with the full rigor, Yitzchak, Abraham, Yaakov, the brothers, doesn't mean they're going to come to the same conclusions. Doesn't mean there's not going to be conflict within them. Yeah.
Also, I think, when you have conflict between a person who does try very hard to look at all these aspects, they're in conflict with somebody that doesn't. It's not important. So who's the giver there? It's always the one who's thinking of the bigger picture.
Right. And the fact is that the people who are thinking of the bigger picture, you put them aside people who are not always thinking of the bigger picture, you really see that. And in many ways that really explains some of the dilemma when you see Yaakov and Asaph or Yishmael and Yitzchak. And it's really an issue of, something, you have to see the big picture all the time. You got to see the big picture all the time.
But the person who sees the big picture, a lot of times, I think, they end up making a decision a little bit to their detriment when they're in conflict with the other.
Totally. And that's part of the process. That's part of the process.
What do you mean?
That's part of the issue you have to think about in terms of the process. The fact of the matter is if you're thinking about the big picture to the detriment of the big picture, because the big picture includes the fact that you have to deal with someone who's not thinking of the big picture, you have to be aware of that. In other words, what I'm trying to say, what I guess is down to, I'm looking at Bereishit, I can go through many of the stories and so forth. But the way I see the stories is people who want to make the right decisions, who want to do the right thing, dealing with the challenge of doing the right thing and trying to work it through in terms of the process. And it involves all these dilemmas, including having to deal with people who, some people are totally black, some people are totally are not meeting the challenge. Right. And it's a challenge we all have to encounter as we're trying to make these decisions.
You have to think for two people.
You have to think for more than you have to think for many people. I mean, the fact is, if you think in terms of I mean, you see these issues like later on in terms of having to deal with things. And the fact that things come out so problematic. I mean, in so many times in Jewish history, you go, like a David Melech, right, whose one desire was to build a temple, and couldn't because he had a job he had to do, which he had to do, which prevented him from being the man of peace who could build a temple. It's a challenge. It's a real challenge. I mean, the fact is that how do you deal with these things? I mean, the point is that in so many ways, it's not. You're right. It's like Esav, because he's a complex figure. It almost becomes more difficult to deal with him. It's not, it really becomes more difficult because, you know, I mean, I think you see it with you know, when Yaakov says Shema Yigrom Hecht, you know, Yaakov is given this promise by God, I'll take care of you, and right away Yaakov is still concerned. God says He's going to take care of you. What are you worried about? Because maybe a sin will get in the way. And the sin that Yaakov was concerned about, because of some Midrashim, was the sin of not properly tending to his parents. Well, he was away. You know what I mean? He was sent there to get married. He was away. You know, but the fact is, he still had the consequence of not being able to foster a relationship with his parents. It's a challenge to him. He felt, boy, maybe that will get in the way. Because Esav was doing a darn good job of that. So the point is, it's not so much, we think in terms of Shema Yigrom Hecht as like, it's like counting, you know, brownie points and oh, well, God will get involved because you deserve to be punished and so forth and so forth. But sometimes the simple problem is there's natural consequences of doing things. Esav is always taking care of Yitzchak and is taking care of him, and Yaakov isn't doing it. There's a natural consequence of that. And he's concerned about that natural consequence. And it's a normal, and does he have a choice there? Can he do something else? Not really. But he had this is the process aspect, and this is the things I think you read about in Bereishit. It's not so much reading about this punishment, this, it's reading about the challenges, and that's why I really think when you see the brothers at the end, it's not this they'll live happily ever after type story. They're still concerned. What will Yosef do? What will happen over here? How will he respond? I mean, there's still a lot of, you know, there's a lot of, even after they reconcile, and even after they go through this whole reconciliation, and it's not so much, I think, because is Joseph going to get us after? It's like, what's he thinking? How's he responding? We don't know. What's the process? What's going to happen now? The rules are changed. How do we take care of this? Yeah,
you know, if Yaakov had not gone to the school of Shem V'Eber, he could have gotten back 14 years earlier to look after his parents. So.
Yeah, but those 14 years he was not held responsible for, because he was learning those 14 years. He was doing something that bounced off the fact that he wasn't with his parents. Because they said
his parents told him to go, but in Aram, he went to go to Lavan. So in order to be able to deal with Lavan, he had to deal with a different set of world circumstances, which is why he needed to go to Shem and Abram.
Which raises the issue. His parents told him to go to Lavan, so why is he held responsible for not honoring his parents when his parents told him to go?
Because that's part of it. To go there, he needed to learn about that type of.
No, that's Shem and Abram, but he was still. Shem and Abram.
How to deal with Lavan.
Yeah, but in the count of how many years Yosef was away, the 14 years at Shem and Aver weren't included. But his time at Padam Aron was. But he had to do that in order to get married, to fulfill his parents' call to them. So why is he being held responsible? He was doing what his parents asked him to do. The point is, there's still consequences. Fact is that that's what I'm trying to say. It's not always punishment. It's consequences. Sabal, his time in yeshiva was not considered to be a consequence that acted negatively in him not being able to take care of his parents. Even though he was justified in not being with his parents, while he was trying to get married, there still was a consequence. You know, it's just we sometimes life throws us curves.
I mean, I think this is why a lot of people can't make a decision, because nothing is, nothing is
Absolutely.
free, nothing is so easy, and there's all these negative possibilities or losses, and people just get paralyzed by that.
Right.
They can't tolerate the dirtiness of it.
You're correct. The fact is that there's the person who makes decisions easily because they can't understand the complexity of the decision.
Right.
So therefore they always make simple decisions.
Yeah.
And then there's the individual who really understands the complexity, and therefore they don't know how to make a decision. We're called upon by God to understand the complexity and to make the decision. And that's not easy. It's not easy. That's really the challenge. We are called upon to see the complexity and to make decisions.
And I hear about people that they don't make any decision without going to their rabbi.
Right, because that's a simple way of making a decision. Anyways, but that's what it's about. Anyways, all I'm trying to say is the book of Bereishit to me is a book of process. It's a book to tell you not the conclusions, not tell you what they finally did, but to watch the way they made the decisions, to watch how they were overcome by the dilemmas they had to face, and to really point out the fact that in many of those decisions you see disagreements. Sometimes the disagreements are really, between a proper decision and an improper decision, but a lot of times you see disagreements over what was the right decision, or the challenge of trying to, and how complex life is and how you have to make those decisions. Okay? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.